Henry, Hart back to the end zone.
48-yard play. Guess who? Bonnie up the middle, making another move to the outside. 15, 10, end zone again.
Keeps it. Nice move by Brown. He's got space. He's got 6. 35-yard touchdown for Byron Brown. A record-setting night for the South Florida quarterback.
Down so far, a little bit of a high snap. Genty right up the middle. Genty has room. Ashton Genty, give him 6.
Second and long. Lagar tries to fit it in. Ramos, it does. Ramos stays up. The show's off his 4-3 wheels. Incredible effort for Ramos.
The G5 Hive. All G5, all the time.
Welcome to the G5 Hive. We are excited to bring you the G5 college football coverage you love each and every week. I am Luke, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justice. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. On X, please give us a follow. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. The G5 Hive merchandise store is now live. The link is in our YouTube video comments, as well as pinned on our X page and here at the bottom of the screen.
Today we have a very special guest episode for you all. We want to spend some time discussing the house settlement, revenue sharing, and NIL, the changes that are coming and what impacts they're having on the group of 5 schools. To help us with that discussion, we have a special guest joining us today. He is the sports of SHSU on X. He is co-host of March to the Pod. He does work for Sam Houston NIL Collective Cat Fund. He is Ben Sorrels. Ben can be found at sports of SHSU on X. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Excited to be here. Ever-changing world of revenue sharing, NIL, and college athletics. And by the time we get done with this and it's released, probably something new will have popped up. So a lot going on, that's for sure.
Well, Ben, it's great to have you back on the show and to help offer a different and unique perspective on today's discussion. But before we get into that, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you have going on, and where else they can find your work?
Yeah, you guys previewed it pretty well there at the beginning, but do a lot of different things. Obviously, I run Sports of SHSU on X and Instagram, covering all 17 sports and almost 18 sports. Beach volleyball for Sam Houston gets started in a month. So 18 sports at Sam Houston through those accounts. Co-host of March to the Pod, which is a podcast with the Dave Campbell's Texas Football Republic of Football Network. Every Wednesday, we come out with episodes covering mainly football, but sports all across campus. And then also very involved in one of the board members with Cat Fund, the NIL Collective at Sam Houston. So proud Bearcat alum, stay very involved, and definitely stay busy covering and helping these teams.
Well, and congrats on the outstanding season. You guys quite the turnaround. I know Luke and I talked about it ad nauseum preseason about how, folks need to watch out for Sam Houston, because while the record wasn't great the previous year, it was just kind of a case of being snake bitten, if you will, right? You were so close in so many games right there, and the bounces just didn't go your way. And so, I don't know, for us, it seemed fairly easy to see that, hey, things were going to even out, and especially Luke, he's a big fan. I think he predicted preseason that you guys would be in the Conference USA championship game, and so it's close.
We were, what was it, a 55-yard field goal and a couple inches away from getting in.
Yeah,
it's close.
Yep. So. All right, well, let's start off with, I guess, the history of NIL. For those that may not know the evolution of things, we'll talk about when NIL started, how it came about, and I guess, to me, it really kind of started in the late 2000s. UCLA basketball star Ed O'Bannon kind of had a lawsuit where he's basically suing EA Sports about the NCAA basketball video game. If you're not familiar with those games back then, now they pay football as a game now, and the players get paid, and their names are in there, their likeness, all that. Well, back in the day, that's not how it was. You just had, Joe Smith, quarterback Sam Houston, and he looked like Hunter Watson, and he had Hunter Watson's attributes, but it wasn't, quote, Hunter Watson. That's kind of how they got around how they kind of got around it back then. But you could, as a user, you could go in and edit the players' names, and that's what people would do, right? They'd go in, and there was a big business making the rosters, right? Staying up all night with your college football magazine, entering all the rosters, so you had the quote real players. So they had that for basketball and for football, and so Ed O'Bannon had a lawsuit about that. You say, hey, you're using my name, you're making money off of me, basically what they were saying. 2015, the courts agreed with him that the NCAA rules were unlawful, that they are a restraint on trade, and they increased the grant and aid limit to the full cost of attendance, which allowed an additional $5,000 per year in additional compensation per player. It's kind of, you see the evolution of how things are kind of moving, right? So you have that. And then in 2019, 2020, you had several states pass laws that permitted college student athletes to monetize their NIL. If you don't know, NIL is name, image, and likeness. And those laws were to be effective in 2022, 2023. Then I guess the next big thing came in 2021, the NCAA versus Austin. Ben was talking off camera about some Austin awards with athletes and how that works, but the Supreme Court rejected the NCAA appeal of its antitrust lawsuit, finalizing that the NCAA is not exempt from antitrust regulations. This ruling opened up the NIL doors and led to the NCAA adopting an interim NIL policy that allowed athletes to benefit financially from their name, image, and likeness without penalty. NIL activity was allowed starting July 1st, 2021. And from there, we had collectives. And even then, like the rules were just like today, right? They were changing very, very quickly. Um, I know some schools took a wait and see approach because the rules were changing so quickly. I think back then, probably the biggest thing was um, getting a 501c3 designation, right? And how that was going to be handled. Um, Big thing for donors, right? Getting a
Yep.
tax credit.
Yep. Yeah, and it's still a big issue. I know obviously NIL became a thing in the summer of 21, and then I believe it was June of 22 the IRS designated that collectives themselves couldn't be 501c3s. And so a lot of collectives have kind of morphed in with foundations that schools have, because foundations are 501c3s, and then now with revenue sharing coming in house through the university, those donations that people make to the athletic department can be tax deductible because the universities are typically 501c3s. So, yeah, there's a lot of tax implications that have come up over the last few years, and still things that people are still trying to figure out, really.
Yeah, the one thing I think, and it's been key from even since NIL and collective started, is flexibility, right? And I think that was the key back then, and I think that's a key point today for collectives is the ability to be flexible, because it's like you said, it's an ever changing landscape. Every day, right now, it seems like every hour there's
Yeah,
something new that's coming along, and collectives to me, like, I just feel like a collective has the ability to be more nimble than, say, like a school's athletic fund, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um,
There definitely is a little more wiggle room there with the collective because it's governed by a board outside of people that are employed by the university. And while you typically work with the coaches and stuff like that at the school, you still have the ultimate say kind of on where the money goes. Which with revenue sharing, it's still kind of yet to be seen. We know how much is going to go to each sport, but how much goes to the quarterback and how much goes to the kicker still remains to be seen. And in a collective, each individual collective can kind of make their own decisions. So definitely is a lot more flexibility, at least right now, it appears, with the collective. And we'll kind of see how that plays out when things go in house and with the schools that do participate in revenue sharing.
so, for the purposes of today's discussion, I just want to kind of give folks, if we can, kind of give folks a general sense of the difference in collectives from, say, like the Alabamas, the Tennessees, the Ohio States of the world to the the teams in the G5. What would you say in general, like a P4? Like what does a top P4 collective look like in terms of funding? Like we're talking $10 million, 15? I don't know.
Yeah, it's not unreasonable to think that much. I know Ohio State, I think, was the top spending school. Not all of this is public, but a lot of it you can kind of figure out. I think they paid 13.5 million to their roster this last year.
And that's just
School,
football.
that's just football, yeah. So that's Ohio State. Your Oregons, your Alabamas, your Georgias, Penn States are probably not too far behind that. When it comes to kind of the lower P4 ranks, I would say 750,000 to a million is kind of what you're looking at.
Yeah.
That's maybe like I know we're close to University of Houston. They're a school that's maybe kind of in that range, a school that's moving up in the Power Four, kind of a lower level Power Four school. And then when you look at G5 schools, it's kind of all over the map. You've got the upper echelon teams like a Boise State or Memphis, kind of like we were talking about earlier.
Well, but I think Memphis is like in their own category.
Yeah, those two specifically, and maybe like a Tulane, maybe USF or a million plus, and they can definitely compete with some of these bigger schools. But then you've got schools kind of in the middle that are paying out a couple 100,000, and then you've got schools towards the very bottom, kind of similar to Sam Houston, that aren't paying out more than sometimes 0 to 100,000. Obviously, service academies don't really pay out NIL. Kennesaw State, I know, had an article come out when they went through their coaching change. Their NIL director said, "We just got things started. We paid out 5,000 in NIL for football athletes." There was an article that came out at Tulsa that they had 0 in NIL this last year. So you've really got everything from 0 to $1 million at the G5 level, but I would say most of them are probably in the 100,000 to $500,000 range. Nothing compared to these Ohio States, Oregons, Alabamas.
Yeah.
But there's even a lot of diversity in what people are paying at the G5 level. So you've got everything from $0 to 13.5 million when it comes to college football.
Yeah, and then like you said, even the G5 level, like the number I've heard from Memphis is like 5 million.
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah, it's
and
in the
like
millions.
to me, I would say the next closest that I know of, and that's because Dirk Cutter just talked about it last week. For the offensive coordinator at Boise, like they were less than 2. I think they were like 1.5, and he says they're hoping to get to 2, and they're probably number 2. So they're like half. They're less than half of what Memphis is. So
Yeah.
Memphis, if folks don't know, Memphis had a big deal with FedEx, I guess, last year,
They did.
and so that's where the majority of that money is coming from. And a lot of times when you hear these numbers, that's all sports. Granted, I don't know. I would venture to guess 90% of it goes to football.
Yeah, I would say that's about right. If you look at these revenue sharing numbers that are coming out from schools, they're revealing probably 85-ish% is going to go to football. If they're going to pay out, for example, the 20.5 million, they're giving 85% of that to football. So yeah, 85-90% of the numbers you see for a school for their total amount of NIL is going to be from football.
So I mean, just a big range, right? You said 13, 15 million for the Alabamas, big Ohio States, to 5 million for the top G5, and then even that's the next guy's the number 2 G5 is only like talking 2 million. But
Right.
yeah, like what you said is kind of what I've heard is like $1 million is kind of like, I don't know, maybe it might be the average. I don't know. It's somewhere near there.
Yeah, in the G5, I think everybody's goal is to get to 1 million. How many get there remains to be seen. It's hard to know because not all of this is disclosed, and
Yeah.
I know the NCAA is kind of working to be able to have all this disclosed and all the numbers out there. And I will say too, a lot of what gets reported is true, but there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there in NIL too.
Oh yeah.
Schools that say they're going to pay out $1 million and end up paying out 200 grand, for example. That's just a random.
And you hear that story from like players all the time, like where
Yeah.
players are promised X amount, they get contacted, they're promised X amount, they end up, going in the portal, going to that school, and what they get is like sometimes to nothing, and
Yep.
it could be half of what they were promised.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys saw, but the Florida State men's basketball team 2 years ago, four different players were promised. Well, they said that there were four different players saying they missed $250,000 in payments, and they're trying to file a class action lawsuit between the four of them and the rest of the teammates for the money they didn't get. And so, is that something that can be enforced? I mean, if there's a contract there that said that the money should have been paid out, yes, but if it's just kind of a verbal handshake agreement and there's nothing in writing, how do you enforce that? So, yeah, I
Right. The
mean,
most
it's
famous being like Saluka. I think most people heard of at
yeah,
UNLV, right? Like
yeah,
where he left after I don't know the first 3 games or whatever it was because he
yeah,
didn't get $100,000 that he was
yeah.
promised. But yeah,
Need
happens all the
everything,
time.
need things in writing. I mean, that's if it's not in writing, I mean, you can't count on it. And it's kind of sad that these kids are promised this money and it doesn't come to fruition. I also think the agents that are representing a lot of these kids aren't the best and maybe taking too much from them. And the NFL, MLB, NBA agents have to be licensed with the Players Association. Um, any of us could say we're a college agent. There's no sort of background check that people have to go through. So I think that's kind of hurting some of it too. And that could have been a reason why the Sluka situation happened, why the Florida State situation happened, is these kids just, you can't count on an 18 to 22-year-old to represent themselves for a $500,000 deal. And sometimes they have people representing them that they shouldn't have representing them. And I think that's part of the problem too.
And on that, Ben, how many people either in your from your perspective, either that you've interacted with or of across the conference or just all of G5, how many of these players have representation of an agent or they just kind of lean on whatever the collective is able to provide?
Yeah, at our level, it's probably a little different than the upper levels, but I would say about 25 to 33%. I would say a quarter to a third of players have agents. At our level, like I said, we're towards the bottom of the money that's being paid out compared to a lot of schools. But I've talked to, I don't know, probably 5 to 10 different agents, and a couple of those agents have, they represent 3 or 4 different guys that we've worked with. So and some of them are very hands on, some of them are very hands off. Sometimes you'll do a deal with a guy, or like we've done deals with guys, and then you see they go in the portal and they tell people to talk to their agent, and we never dealt with their agent before. So some of them have agents, some of them don't, some of them don't have them, and then they get in the portal and then they do have them. I would say that's when players trying to pick up agents the most is when they go in the portal to see what's out there. So definitely have worked with agents. I would say more often than not they don't have an agent, but definitely do come across it. I would say 25% of the time, maybe a third of the time.
So, is there a difference? Like, let's say I'm a business, and I want a player from Sam Houston's football team to do a commercial for my car dealership. Is there a difference between me going to the collective and saying, "Hey, can I get a football player?" versus, "Hey, can I get player X or player Y to do this commercial?"
Yeah, I think there definitely is. Even at our level, the marketability of the quarterback versus the tight end versus the left outside linebacker is a pretty big difference, and it's even a bigger difference probably at the Alabamas and Georgias and Oregons and stuff like that. So there definitely is a big difference. The tax write-offs are a little different too when you're talking about businesses. Do they want to go through the collective? Do they want to make the deal themselves? There's different ways and different tax implications when it comes to that. So yeah, I would definitely say there is a difference, and I know we've done some football brand stuff, and it's been for our top names at the school. And part of that too is to be able to reward players, and us as a collective, we want to be able to get that money to our better players so we can be more competitive in retaining those players. And so I think that's part of it too. So I think the marketability of it is a big part. And then also as a collective, we might suggest that, hey, we need to get the money to our star wide receiver because we need to get him some money and we want to be able to keep him. So I think those are two things that kind of come into play when these brands are reaching out for deals, and we're trying to facilitate deals with these brands.
All right. Well, I think we kind of covered like how NIL started, the history of it, kind of what it looked like back then. I guess the next big development would be the House settlement, and that was a antitrust lawsuit. It comes from I guess House. There's a player whose last name was House. That's where House comes from. I think he was a swimmer. I think, I believe is I think he was a swimmer. But anyway, basically it was an antitrust lawsuit for back damages to athletes, saying, hey, you made all this money using our NIL, and you're using our name, image, and likeness way back when. You owe us back pay. This was a settlement that was reached on October 7th, 2024, and there's really three key parts to that settlement. There's $2.8 billion in back pay to former athletes. For the most part, it's covering from 2016 to 2021. That back pay is distributed over a 10-year period through reductions in NCAA and school revenues that they bring in. And each athlete gets a different amount. I don't really remember seeing anything that kind of tells you who makes what. I would assume, generally speaking, a football player is going to make more than a swimmer.
Yeah.
The next key point is there's a revenue sharing concept, permitting schools to share more than $20 million annually with their athletes. And we'll talk about that when we get to revenue sharing. That's the revenue sharing portion. That's where the revenue sharing comes from. And then this third point, which I think, if there's going to be something that I guess causes the settlement to not be fully approved, this would be the one I think that could do it. And that's roster limits on sports. Not a big deal for football, but as we're hearing in a lot of the Olympic sports, it's a really big deal. So the roster limits for football are 105. And all these changes are currently set to take effect on July 1st of 2025. I believe the fully approved or denial date, I think it's April 7th.
I think that's right.
Is when that can happen. But to me, like there are other things coming out that could cause this to fail. But of those 3 points, like the roster limits, like you're hearing about like swimming teams that are going to have to cut half the roster, or diving teams are going to have to cut half the roster to meet these limits. And I think the thing that's key about this settlement is this isn't something that like on April 7th they can modify. It's either they got to fully approve it as is, or they got to deny it as is. They can't come back and say, well, we want to add X number of roster spots to swimming. Like there's for that April 7th date, there's no room to quote edit it. It's either approve it as is or deny it as is.
Yeah.
And that roster limit thing does seem to be a big deal, like I said, for the non-Olympic sports.
Yeah, and I know y'all are a football show too, and the implications on football are big, and how many roster spots teams are going to add. I think Ohio State said they're the highest revenue school of any college athletic program, and I think they said they're bumping up to 95 scholarships next year. And so, what do schools do with that, with the ability to go up to 105 scholarships? Because that's a pretty drastic increase from the 85 you have now. So, what do schools do there? I think is going to be interesting to see, and what kind of effect does it have on other sports? I mean, if you add 20 scholarships in football, and maybe you can't fund them for swimming, like you said, and so that trickle effect is going to be very interesting to see what schools do, especially football. And the other thing too, at the beginning, you talked about the back pay that the NCAA is going to have to pay, and pretty much every school is going to have to pay. That's within the NCAA is going to have to pay to some degree into that back pay. Obviously, I think the bigger schools are paying a lot more. I forget the exact breakdown, but I mean, even a school like Sam Houston, some of our revenue is going to be cut out for the next 10 years because of that. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, a lot of schools are going to be impacted by that back pay and revenue, and it's going to take some out of their annual athletic budget revenue going forward.
So, like, looking at like the roster limits, like you said, it's 85 scholarship before, but there really weren't any quote functional limits in terms of how many other players you can have on the team, right? I guess it was up to each school, and I think what we saw happening, and so I think this is a good thing for college football. What you saw happening is, you know, the Alabamas, Ohio States of the world, they were basically giving athletes scholarship NIL deals. I guess is what I would call them, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we can't give you a scholarship to play football, but we're going to give you an NIL deal, the equivalent of to pay your tuition. So it's like kind of like your own scholarship.
Yeah.
And so they were able to, that before this they were unlimited, right? They could have, an extra 50 guys quote on NIL scholarship.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just crazy, right? I mean, like that's not that it's ever going to be an even playing field, but like that's just insane. Like that you allowed schools to kind of use this loophole, if you will, to have so many extra players.
Yeah, no, it is a big deal, and you can cap it at 105 now. And on a much smaller scale, we kind of see that with specialists and how we might be able to get specialist guys over other schools. I mean, at the G5 level, if another school's not going to offer a specialist a scholarship, and they might be kind of above where your school is, if you can offer them a scholarship, find a way to do it, they might come to you because that's a lot of extra money they're going to make. And so that's kind of the small potatoes way that we've seen it done in the past. But yeah, it's good to get to that 105 number for the roster limits.
So we'll move over to the revenue sharing. I guess this is kind of the what most folks think is like the big deal in this settlement. As we said, schools will have the ability, assuming this gets fully approved in April, starting July 1st, they will have the ability to share revenues with athletes. The one thing that I mean, I guess it's not. I haven't really heard the official number. Like some folks are saying 20.5 million. Some folks say 22 million. Do you know what that actual number is, or is there
Yeah,
still some uncertainty on what the actual number is?
yeah, I think when it first came out, it was 22, but the number I keep seeing is 20 and a half. And I think Texas Tech came out with some numbers a couple weeks ago. And I mean, Texas Tech is one of the biggest athletic departments in the country, and they had 20 and a half on there. So that's kind of the route I'm deferring to, is that 20 and a half. And I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more, but the consequential effects that 20 and a half million is going to have on an athletic department, where they can find that money, where they might have to take money away from, is going to be interesting. And we've already seen some of it with some restructuring of coach contracts at the Power Four level, because those schools have to pay it out to as close to 20.5 million as they can. So that's the thing I'm really watching when it comes to revenue sharing, is how schools find a way to pay for this kind of stuff.
And to that point, for folks that may not know, like so, all the House settlement will do is give you the ability to do it. Doesn't necessarily give you the means to do it, right? So it's
Right.
up to each school to, number one, I guess the first decision is, are we going to do it? Are we going to do any revenue sharing? And if we are, what are we going to do? Are we going to go up to the $20.5 million limit? Are we going to do something less than that? That's kind of up to each individual school to decide. And then once they decide what they're going to do, then they got to figure out where the funds are coming from, right?
Yep.
And that can be an even bigger challenge.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
and you're gonna see it all over the place, right? You're gonna see schools fund the full amount. You're gonna see some schools that aren't gonna do anything. That's just
Yep.
and everything in between.
Yeah, and where they get that 20.5 is going to be interesting. How they distribute the 20.5 is going to be interesting. I know Texas A&M, I keep bringing up Texas schools, but I mean, we just see so much Texas stuff, and there's so many of them by Sam Houston, but they've got such a big number with Jimbo's buyout that they've got to pay out over the next 8 to 10 years, that I know they made some really big cutbacks in the athletic department and had to lay off a lot of people just to be able to pay this revenue sharing that's coming up because they know they need to pay out the full 20.5 million. They've already got a huge financial burden with Jimbo's contract. I think it was 76 million over 8 to 10 years that they have to pay out. And the only way they can find a way to be able to get the money is by cutting back on jobs. And it's an unfortunate reality of it. I know Ohio State, I think, has done some of it too. Ross Bjork going from A&M to Ohio State kind of sharing the same strategy. So cutbacks in people's jobs, coaches having to give payback, reducing Olympic sports like we've talked about. I mean, how they pay for this 20.5 million, if that's what they're going to pay out, is going to be really interesting.
I mean, obviously,
So you talk about.
I was just
Go
saying
ahead,
they can get more
Justin.
donations too, right?
Yeah.
But like it's not like donations are like this. They're not infinite, right? I mean, people can only give what they can give. It's not an infinite supply of money. But obviously, they're going to keep asking for more and more. I guess to me, the biggest fear is at some point, like they start outpricing themselves, right? Like if it gets to the point where you can go to an NFL game cheaper than a college football game, I mean that's what people are going to do. I feel like you can't price yourself out of, but so much more than where you're already priced at. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge to see where, for a lot of teams, where they're going to get that additional money from.
Yeah.
And then just like one question that I feel earlier in the week that I wanted to make sure to ask, and you kind of touched on it, was these schools, how you come up with this 20.5 is up to each and every school themselves. They can cut personnel, they can cut sports. Do you know if you can set aside TV money, or is it you can also just do like fundraising? Are all those options available?
Yeah, it's kind of an all hands on deck approach. I think one of the most interesting ideas that I've seen that a school has come up with is the University of Tennessee has implemented a 10% talent fee on all season tickets, and that money is going to help fund revenue sharing. So it could really be anything from cutting jobs to adding additional pricing to tickets, and like you said, that could begin to price people out. TV money, trying to raise more money from boosters, whatever it might be. And I think I saw it in the
Student
show.
fees.
Yeah, student fees, trying to increase those. And I think I saw it in the show notes too, talking about how some collectives or some schools are ending partnerships with collectives because they need the money in-house now. And so I think there's a million different ways to go about it. And it's going to be interesting to see how schools can come up with creative ways to be able to fund it to get as close to the 20.5 million as they can. But I thought that 10% talent fee at Tennessee on their season tickets for all sports was something that was interesting and caught my eye.
And I saw, I think it was Oklahoma State, or it was a P4 school where they talked about like one thing they're going to start doing. I guess the naming rights for the stadium are up for availability, and then with the ability to add sponsor logos on the field now, that was something else that they were going to start doing just in an effort to kind of raise more money to do revenue sharing.
Yeah, Go ahead, Luke.
I just remember like we were talking about Memphis. It's like how funny would it be for UPS to like take out this big ad on the field at Memphis, and FedEx Land.
Yeah, naming rights are big. I mean, and especially at G5 schools, there's not a ton of G5 schools that have naming rights. And I know I'm bringing up another Texas school, but Texas State just got naming rights for their stadium that starts this coming year. And I think it's $1 million or $1.5 million a year for 5 years, and they have an option for 3 to 5 more years after that at $3 million a year. So, I mean, 1.5 million by itself for a school like Texas State, if they can funnel all that to revenue sharing, that's a huge win for them at the G5 level that not a lot of schools would be able to do. So, I mean, it's going to take a lot of creative ways to do it, but it's kind of something you have to do to be able to compete.
Another example would be like the FIU and Pitbull Stadium and how they kind of worked on that. And I think something was about it's X amount of dollars, but then there's going to be so many Pitbull sponsored talents at halftime and this, and he's going to have
Yeah.
so many concerts there and such and such. But yeah.
Yeah, I think he gets access to the stadium for 5 events a year that he can do whatever he wants. And they still can't win on Vice Night. I'm sorry, FIU, you lost again this year. We were taking pictures in the boats on the field after the game. So they've got a cool stadium name, but they still can't win on Vice Night.
Those Vice uniforms they're pretty cool. I do like those.
They are. That was a very ugly game between us, but the uniforms were nice, and it was nice that we got a win.
I would assume like the expectation on the P4 level in terms of revenue sharing is that all of them or the majority of them are going to spend the max or try to find a way to spend the max, because if they don't, they're just not going to be competitive. That's the facts.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was going to say, I'm bringing up another Texas school. I keep doing it, but University of Houston, one of the lower P4 schools, announced $18 million for next year. So they're pretty close to the full $20.5 million, and they're towards the bottom, quote unquote, of the Power Four right now. So I totally agree with that.
So you have to pretty much say what your number is before you go out and do it. Is that my understanding then?
Yeah, I don't know if you have to disclose it, but it definitely helps if you do.
I mean, it's going to eventually be disclosed in the books,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But you don't. Yeah, I don't think you have to.
It'll eventually be disclosed, and I mean, if you're a football coach, you can say we've publicly come out as a university and said we're paying 18 million as a whole, and 15 of that 18 million is going to football, and so that's where we're getting your money from. So I think it's almost a recruiting tactic to say, hey, we're paying 18 million, and if there's another school that's only paying 12, well, we're above that school, so you can kind of say that in recruiting.
We touched on that P4 schools, but what do you think about that expectation from the G5 level, and how close they're going to get to that?
It's interesting because there really has been no disclosure of kind of what like group of 5 schools are going to do. I know us at Sam Houston at the moment, there's really no plan for revenue sharing, and I would imagine a lot of schools are still that way, at least at the moment. So it's tough to know. I mean, and we keep going back to Memphis and Boise, but I would imagine they share up to a certain amount that's going to be pretty competitive. But there really hasn't been a lot said for these G5 schools. And I brought it up beforehand. The smallest school that I've seen announce revenue sharing for next year is VCU, and they don't have a football program, so they're going to be funding basketball really heavily. But I haven't seen a lot of smaller schools announce a formal plan for revenue sharing. The formal plans that we've seen shared have been like your Ohio States, your Texas Techs, your University of Houston, stuff like that. So I am intrigued to kind of see what schools like a Conference USA school or a MAC school or a Sun Belt school do that are kind of towards the very bottom of athletic revenue on an annual basis. So I'm even intrigued to see what schools do with that.
And there is a particular date that you have to say we are going to be a part of this or are not going to be a part of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it's probably the start of the athletic calendar year or the next school year, which is, I think, July 1st with a lot of places. That's the way. That's when a lot of new academic and athletic years start. So I would think you would have to have that budget in place. I know we're in the Texas State University system, and all of our financials are disclosed, and you have to have your athletic budget ready for, I think it's the August meeting. So for a school like us, I would assume we would have to have it in writing in the budget by that August meeting, probably need to have it in place by July. And I would assume other schools would have to follow kind of a similar situation.
One school that we haven't talked about, because from my understanding, their NIL situation isn't very good at all. But I think when you start talking about revenue sharing, I think they will be a much bigger player than they have been in terms of NIL. And that's Liberty. Like I've always heard their NIL situation wasn't great, but I've also always heard that school has a lot of money, like the school itself. And so I expect them to be big players from a revenue sharing perspective. I've always heard when they couldn't get into a conference that was the reason, was because the resources that they had available dwarfed so many other G5s that the G5s didn't want to be in a conference with them. And So I think that's I haven't heard you guys being in Conference USA, maybe you've heard about it more, but I haven't
Yeah.
heard a lot of people talk about that in terms of them being a major player, assuming revenue sharing gets approved.
Yeah, I think in Conference USA they're a major player with NIL, but that's just because of the landscape of schools in Conference USA. I've heard some of the numbers they've thrown out at Conference USA meetings and like media days. Nothing exact, but just kind of where they are compared to where we are. But I just looked up their athletic budget and I saw for 2022 was almost 58 million, where Sam Houston and Jacksonville State are 23 to 25 million. So that's a great point that their revenue share, if they do opt into it's probably going to be a lot more than schools like Sam Houston or a Jacksonville State. And so they're competitive with NIL within Conference USA, maybe with not the entire G5 landscape. But that 58 million in athletic budget on an annual basis, I mean, that is very competitive within the G5.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that is something to watch because Liberty, with their facilities and their budget and the decent NIL they already have, I mean, they're going to be good. I think they're going to be set.
With the revenue sharing, like NIL agreements we talked about, they're not it's not public information. But with revenue sharing, do you think schools schools are obviously gonna have to report on what they're doing,
Mhm.
but are they gonna have to report it in terms of, hey, we paid the football team X amount, or we paid Joe Smith quarterback X amount?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to come down to an individual player basis, but I know at Sam Houston, every year there's a line item budget for every sport that can be found in the board materials, that can be found in the overall university spending. And so if the football budget for us jumps from 5.5 million to 8 million all of a sudden, I would assume there's a line item in there that's for revenue sharing and it's going to say revenue sharing, and that's where it's coming from. So all the public universities out there, I would imagine we get to some degree some sort of information on how much they're spending on each sport when it comes to revenue sharing, but probably not what it is for each
Player.
individual athlete, is my guess.
And obviously, I think from a non from like the Olympic sports, this could potentially hurt a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
They could lose, they could lose roster spots. Some of them, I would imagine, might just cease to exist, right? When you're talking about money and they're looking to cut money, I think those are prime candidates for them to save some money to be able to spend on football or even men's basketball.
Yeah, and another point with the Olympic sports, and this is a part of the ever changing landscape, is the current administration of the White House or in the House of Representative Congress, whatever you want to call it, said that since the money is coming from the school, it's subject to Title IX, and so it needs to be distributed evenly among male and female sports. And so, does that pass? Does that go through? That'll be something that's going to be very interesting to watch, because if it does end up having to be split between men and women's sports, that might be a good thing for women's sports on the Olympic sport kind of side. And when it comes to swimming, diving, wrestling, gymnastics, all that, maybe not on the men's side, but I know it would help on the women's side if that did come through. But I mean, that's still up in the air and something that's 48 to 72 hours new, and people are still trying to figure out.
So, while we don't expect the G5 and the P4 the numbers to be the same in terms of how much they're going to do through revenue sharing, but I would assume like the percentages would be similar, right? Like
Yeah.
85 to 90% football, the next, I don't know, 5% to men's basketball, and then the rest of the sports get the last 5% or so. Would you think? I mean,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that'll
and
hold
I
up.
would even think it might be more towards football, just because, especially if there's no G4 P5 split. I mean, they're going to do everything they can to be able to compete for that kind of talent. So they might try to pour even more in there, so they can get a little closer to the numbers that the P4 schools are pushing out. But I would imagine they're similar, if not identical, to the numbers that we've kind of seen shared so far.
And this revenue sharing, it's a cap, right? I mean, it's a cap in terms of what the school itself can do, right?
Right.
So the school can only spend up to 20.5 million on athletes. I assume there's got to be some kind of escalator in there. I don't know. I don't know what
Yeah.
it is. I don't know what
Yeah.
it's tied to, but I assume there's got to be something.
I've seen that there's a plan for the next 2 years for it to go up 4% for each of the next 2 years after if it does get implemented in 2025. That's what I've seen. I don't know if that's for sure, but that would kind of make sense, a 4% increase each year. And we'll see if that happens. And like you said, that's just revenue sharing. There can still be collective pay,
Yep.
but a lot of this money that's going to collectives, I would imagine, starts to get poured into the university because of one, tax deductions that a lot of schools can offer for people directly donating to the university. They might not be able to get that through donating to a collective. And then two, the university needs it to be able to get to that 20.5 million. So how involved collectives will be in the revenue sharing area is going to be interesting. I know they're probably still going to exist at some of the bigger schools, but with the G5 lower level P4 schools, I would imagine the collectives aren't going to be as involved because they're going to try to funnel as much as they can into the revenue sharing that comes from the university.
Before we get, I guess, to the collectives and what the future looks like for them, one last thing I want to talk about on revenue sharing is essentially what this is a salary cap. But do you think this is kind of like the beginning stages of perhaps in the future, a functional salary cap for college athletics?
Yeah, I think it's definitely heading towards that, and I think it's needed almost to kind of even out the playing field with a lot of these schools. So it definitely feels like a salary cap. It's not really called a salary cap, but I think it's going to help. Create some more parity, and I think we're even seeing some more parity kind of in the college football landscape with some of the teams that are able to compete nowadays because they can spend a little more money. I mean, like Vanderbilt, for example. Vanderbilt's got some big money at their school that they're able to pay out now, and their football team's kind of heading in the right direction. So I think it's going to help create some more parity too.
All right. So what does this all mean, like for collectives, where we stand today? So collectives can and they likely still will exist. They can still engage in NIL agreements with athletes. These agreements have to be for valid business purposes to promote goods and services and payments at fair market value. Um, the big question is, what is fair market value? How is that going to be determined? We don't know the answers to those questions yet. Um, all contracts, I believe it's over $600,
Yep.
will be submitted to some sort of overseer. And then they will, if they say, no, you can't do this, then it can go to arbitration. What we talked about earlier, what we're seeing is, some schools, and we've seen both P4 and G5 are shutting down their collectives and moving everything in house towards revenue sharing. Like you said, we've seen it with James Madison. Probably the biggest school I saw it was Colorado, in the Big 12 announced that they were shutting down their collective. Why? I mean, I guess they want to get to this money, but like from my perspective, it would seem if I'm a G5 or a P4, number one, I want to keep the collective for a variety of reasons. Number one, it allows me to go over that cap. Like there is no cap governing what a private party can do. But number two, it adds a lot of flexibility. Well, like you talked earlier, this, I guess we'll call it guidance, this Title IX guidance, because it's not actually law. And there's been questions like if someone sued them, like it wouldn't pass, it wouldn't get approved in a court of law. But for the sake of argument, let's just say this Title IX stuff does go forward, and it has to be, you have to be in accordance with Title IX with revenue sharing. Well, guess what? That doesn't apply to a collective. Collective can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And so it just seems to me like the schools that are getting rid of their collectives, going all in on revenue sharing, are really kind of, I don't know, maybe jumping the gun a little bit and possibly doing a disservice just because we don't know what's going to happen. It changes like every day. And if nothing else, the collective offers a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, and I think the best way, in my opinion, to go about it is I think Colorado ended their partnership, is how they technically worded it. I think the collective is still around, but they ended their partnership, so they're not endorsing the collective anymore. And I think that helps to be able to get more people to donate to the school to get to that 20.5. And then you can still keep the collective around for anything on top of that. So like you said, I don't think shutting them down is the best idea. I have seen some shut down. I think just maybe ending the partnership so you can make sure you can get that 20.5 in-house and then still have the collective for anything extra. That's probably the best way to go about it, in my opinion. But like you said, shutting it down probably isn't the best thing to
So,
do.
so how does that work in terms of either logistical or relationship wise of ending a partnership of like, hey, we love what you guys have been doing, but we need this 20.5 million, or from a G5 perspective, whatever we're agreeing to, before like we want you to get your thing, and like you provide us this. Like how does that, I guess, how does that ending of the relationship or ties kind of there, how does that affect that dynamic?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think one, the visibility of the collective is going to go down. A lot of these partnerships that schools have with collectives, you see promotions for it on school websites, at athletic events, and so I think that is going to go down a little bit. The visibility of it with the school and kind of their partnership, and then I really think that's kind of the biggest part. I think working with athletes is going to be a little bit different too. Some of these schools have official, like we said, official partnerships with collectives through like an Open Doors or through a Teamworks kind of thing, and collectives work with athletes. Um, well, people can donate to the collective, and the collective can put together deals through those sites, and so that might not happen as much, and so schools can put the deals together directly, and so how the deal gets put together might be a little differently nowadays. But I think the marketing and promotion of the collective is going to be a little different, and then how the deals get put into place, I think, is going to be a little different because it's not going directly through the collective and kind of what they do and what the school's promoting, and it's going to go directly through the school. So I think those are kind of the two big differences that I could see and how it might impact the collectives that do stick around.
One thing I think that maybe folks don't necessarily understand is, or maybe the relationship is not as clear, is like what kind of effect you think this is going to have on between the dynamic between, hey, do I give to the NIL? Do I give to the school itself? I know, like, I think sometimes folks have trust issues, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard folks that say, which I think some people will think the statement is odd, but I don't really think it is that some things I'd rather trust a collective to do the right thing with my money rather than the school. And I think, to a normal person that probably doesn't sound right, but I think folks that probably cover or are more involved in athletics probably understand where that would come from. But
Yeah.
do you see that, and how do you see that kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I could see it both ways. I think some people, if they love the AD, they would love to give more money to, or they would like to just start giving it to the athletic department. So I see it that way. But I also see it on the collective side too. If I'm giving to the collective is going to be working with the coaches and people on staff to determine where this money needs to go and how it needs to get there. And it's going to go to the way it needs to best be suited. And I would rather give that way than to the university, who maybe just doesn't understand where the money needs to go. They say we're going to give 20% to the quarterback, 20% to the O line. Everybody's going to get the same thing.
Or does it even go to it might not go to that. It might go to something completely
it
different.
could go to a different sport. And a lot of these collectives, like even we have a setup where if there's giving over X amount of dollars, you get to choose what sport or player it goes to. And you might not get that kind of flexibility within giving to the athletic department. There might be some people that want to give it to the athletic department because they like the AD, they like the people in advancement, whatever that might be. But yeah, I could definitely see how there would be situations where people would still want to give it to the collective. And some of these people that work for collectives are starting to work in-house for universities. And I've seen people that have worked for the universities or for teams, they leave the team and they go run the collective because they have an idea of how things need to be run. I've heard of a couple GMs in college football leaving the GM role to go run the NIL collective because they kind of know where the money needs to go to. And they can figure things out from there. So it definitely is an interesting dynamic to see kind of what people's feelings are, and do they still want to give to the collective because there's more flexibility there.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time today. I guess I'd like to kind of close things out with what do we think the future looks like?
Yeah.
I know from my perspective, where I think things are headed. I wish they'd get there faster. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I feel like at some point, what you're going to have is athletes are going to be employees of schools, or some athletes. Maybe it's just football, basketball, whatever. But some athletes will be employees of schools, and then you're going to have a collective bargaining agreement.
Yeah.
To me, it just seems obvious that's where this is headed. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get there. But be interested to hear your thoughts of how you kind of see the future shaping up.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that come to mind. I'm glad you brought up contracts because that's going to be a big one. Are these contracts that they're signing with players, are they going to be 4-year deals? And if you don't stay for the whole 4 years, does your next school have to buy out some of the deal? I think that's going to be a real interesting part of it. And then I've brought it up a couple times before the show and on the show now is I think with this revenue sharing and the discrepancy between the G5 and the P4, I think that split between the two almost feels more inevitable now, just because the gap in the amount of money is so immense between your Ohio States and a Sam Houston. And so I think that how the contracts are going to be managed, are players going to have to be locked in for a certain amount of years? Is there going to be a CBA? Are you going to have to buy out contracts? I think that's going to be fascinating to watch, and something I think that probably is going to happen. And then when does this split happen? I know people have talked about it for a while, but kind of feels like we're delaying the inevitable at this point. When does that start to happen? So there's a ton of moving parts, and I think you could also throw in the Title IX stuff too. I mean, do I think it's going to go through? Probably not, but I mean, you never know. And if it does, it's definitely something to look at because I think that changes a lot. If you have to end up spending 10.1 million or 10.25 million of your 20.5 million on women's sports, and you can't just give it all to football. So those are kind of the
well,
three big things.
there's gonna be some interesting things with collectives, right?
Yeah.
The school's gonna hire the collective to do something
Yeah.
and give them a large amount of money, and that money will go to football.
Yeah,
Or,
there's so many in the collective side of it too. How involved do collectives continue to be? I mean, there's just so many things to watch with this, and I feel like it's just going to move really quick because, like you said, the April pass or fail date, kind of with the House settlement. I think things are going to pass, so they go into effect in July, and I mean, we're really going to kind of see the effects of what this looks like from a business perspective for these schools, but also from a competition perspective. And is there going to be a bigger gap between Ohio State and Sam Houston as time goes on? So definitely a lot to watch and look forward to.
I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, it just came out, a couple days ago, but this defensive back for Wisconsin, Xavier Lucas, who then is he then goes to Miami. He doesn't get into the transfer portal, but he transfers. And this issue with the NCAA, and then, essentially then Wisconsin says no, like in part of this revenue sharing, he signed a contract. Well, essentially that kind of feels like a pay for play contract type thing. What is your take on how that has come out so far?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly haven't looked into it enough as I should. It has been a crazy week. We have a massive baseball auction next week, so it's kind of been. I keep seeing it pop up, but I haven't looked into it a ton. I think he's at Miami now, but and the big thing with him going to Miami, and it looks like he's kind of gotten out of Wisconsin, and whatever deal he had there is it just kind of feels like everybody's siding with the player mobility side, and it just feels like the NCAA and universities keep getting kind of screwed, and they don't really have any leverage anymore on these players. And so I don't know what kind of contract he did have signed there, but if he did have a contract signed, that makes things really interesting, especially if it said he's supposed to be there for next year, and how that's enforced, what that looks like going forward. I think it's going to be interesting, but I think it just continues to show the player mobility and kind of that players have all the power, because it sounds like he's on the right side of things right now, and he's going to end up at Miami from what it seems like.
yeah, it's that was the second time that I've heard of a multi-year contract. So when Darian Mensah went from Tulane to Duke, right? And they
Yeah.
talked about that being a 2-year contract. NIL, that was the first time I heard that. And that where I had heard it lasting, I mean, from what I've heard, like essentially these contracts, they're not even a year-long contract. They're a seasonal contract. While your sport is in season, this is what your NIL is.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, even on just the NIL side stuff, we've implemented, and a lot of schools implemented, is you have to be enrolled at whatever university it is. I've seen collectives do that, and then you also have to be living within a 50-mile or 1-hour radius or whatever it might be of where the university is located for the entire deal to be able to be seen to completion. So it might be a monthly installment deal for 2 years, but they might have a clause in there that says if you don't live within a 30-mile radius of the school, the contract is null and void at that point. So how schools work that into their contracts, I mean, that'll be interesting, but I know a lot of collectives do that to be able to protect themselves if they do have a longer-term deal in place with players.
Well, Ben, it's coming to the end of our time. We want to thank you again for your time today and sharing your perspectives with us. We greatly appreciate it. We definitely have you back on again to preview Sam Houston football sometime after spring practice. But with the way things are going in this revenue sharing, NIL, house settlement stuff, maybe we'll have you on again sometime this spring to talk about what's going on and where we think things are headed. But yeah, we definitely appreciate your time.
Yeah, appreciate you guys having me. Yeah, I'm sure something's going to change by the time this gets released. And yeah, I'm excited for whenever we get to talk some Sam Houston football. Even I have some studying up to do. 44 players departing. We've got 9 freshmen coming in, 20 players signed already. So player mobility and players in and out, it's been crazy to track. But it's been a lot of fun, and looking forward to whenever we get to talk next.
Well, Ben, something you might not be aware of, but we have guests on, doing all of our series and whatnot. But I believe you are our first multi-time guest. Yeah. So that is a trophy. Your trophy's in the mail. It will be coming. It is probably a great honor and probably, one you can talk at when it comes to Thanksgiving next year. You can talk about how you were thankful for that, because at that point you'll be on 3 times, so at least.
Yeah,
so
it's definitely going in the bio on X and Instagram. First multi-time guest appearance on the G5 Hive.
Well, again, thank you again for your time. Come back and join us next week as we continue our discussion on the house settlement, revenue sharing, and NIL with a different perspective. We'll sit down with former coach, current director of football, and consulting company that specializes in the transfer portal, recruiting assistant, athlete marketing, coaching advancement, and will offer a unique and different perspective on this subject. If you are watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're on X, give us a follow. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please subscribe and leave those 5-star ratings and reviews. Thank you all for your support. Until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.